Hi. Here we are, chapter 5 of the Gospel of Mark. Uh, just as a reminder, why should we study the culture of the Bible or really of any text? Well, the thing is, the biggest problem with reading a text is not what you get from it, but what you bring to it. In other words, if you're reading a text from any time period other than right now from your general area, you're going to have a different understanding of not only what the words mean, such as cool, but also what the social um, get up of the word means. So, what marriage means to you is going to be almost totally different than what it means in the first century Palestine. And so for you to not take into account that you need to understand what their culture was like so that you can fully understand what the text is talking about. That's true about male and female. There's such a tremendous difference between how women were treated. The collective society, which still 80% of the world is a collective society versus our individualist society. And so you oral, we talked about this, I think, in the last chapter about how a person who grows up in an oral culture and isn't necessarily have the skill of being able to read, that what they learn through experience. So everything has a deeper meaning and also has a better chance of becoming long-term memory. So just a few of the reasons why we need to study culture, because people are the same biologically. We're all made up the same, and we all respond to the natural properties like gravity the same way. And we all have a need for food, shelter, clothing, and relationships. But it's the last of these examples that make up a culture, how you go about getting food, eating what food, how you dress, what a family consists of, and how each member is treated, as well as where you live. There are so many different ways to go about that, and that is what basically culture is. Of course, you have to throw in religion and spiritual beliefs and the how you govern a group that's more than two. Well, actually, just pretty much two and bigger. So that is culture. So it's worth understanding. And one of the biggest things that is different about our culture in the first century Palestine is honor. They held that as their highest value. And honor is basically what people think about you. So it involves the public and how you then act to see if your actions correlate to your honor status. In an honor society, men can gain honor, whereas only women can protect their honor. And so your honor is first based on your family and then the town you're from. And then it goes on to your trade or how you work. And you always did what your father did, except in the case of John the Baptist, who prophets pretty much come from anywhere. So honor is going to be challenged anytime a male was in public, and again, that's more than three people. So they were always looking, who is everybody acting right? Is everybody keeping to their honor status? And if not, we're going to challenge them. And so it was very, very strict in the way they did it. And the way what Jesus did within this culture, which has implications in anybody's culture, is that he changed the way that you deal with honor. One of the things he did is that it still was a pivotal cultural value that, but now where you're born and what you do is irrelevant. It has to do, God gives this, the social status or honor comes from God. So now, when he said, these are my brothers, these are my sisters, he was saying, in essence, no longer are we divided by our families or where we're born, but God gives us the honor, and it is unconditional, and you belong to God's family. Another way he changed their understanding of honor is that women were equal and meant as much to Jesus as men did. And that would have been pretty mind-blowing in that culture. And instead of seeking honor, which was what every man did, instead you seek to serve people, to be humble. And in a regular honor status society, if you act humble, you're losing your honor. But with Jesus, that became the way that you acted. Also, honor was considered a limited supply, just like everything else was, except children and the harvest in those days. So you only have so much of an item, and if someone gets some, then someone else loses some. And that's how they viewed honor and why they fought over it all the time. Well, Jesus changed that to honor is unlimited because it all comes from God. You didn't have to defend your honor because you got your honor from God, and he never changes. Retaliation was, we talked last week quite about a bit, and we will again over and over, because it still continues, that Jesus was constantly challenged in acting above his honor status, and he would then respond with either what he said or a miracle or a healing, and then the public would give their verdict. Many times they were amazed. Other times part of the crowd were the Pharisees, and they were angry and wanted to kill him. So Jesus is saying, instead of having to defend yourself now, you can turn the other cheek. You can humbly serve one another. And meals were so important in those days, and it was a time where everybody would restate in their honor. There were certain places at the table, if you were better than someone else, you sat, and that you were even invited by a certain person of honor would give you honor, or just fortify what you already had. And in those days, remember, it was very public. People of lower economic status often did everything outside because their climate allowed them to do so. And people always saw what everybody was doing. And even the rich, when they'd have a dinner, they would allow other people to come in the banquet hall and sit along the wall so that they could watch what was happening. I've had a hard time thinking up an equivalent for us today, but it was sort of like what debates used to be, political debates, where there was a real tug back and forth, and some people lost and some people won. And we don't get that so much now, but that's the closest I could get to it. So that's some of the way that Jesus changed honor. And we can see that in our personal life with the Lord, the humility, and how even now we if we are secure in who we are in Jesus and what God thinks of it, then we don't worry about what other people think, and we can treat and serve them as we should. Okay, now chapter 5, we find Jesus. Now, Jesus, they just got on the boat and Jesus told the storm to be quiet. So he just left the disciples terrified of losing their life and then realizing that they're with a man that can control the sea. So we are just left that scene, and we're going to go to some incredible stories. And the one at the end about the woman reaching for the garment is just revealed something to me that was just incredible. I just had to think about it for quite a while. But we'll get to that. So chapter 5, they go to the other side of the lake, Sea of Galilee. And if you look on a map, Capernaum is up north. They're going to go a little southeast. And it doesn't take long to get there, just a couple of hours, but I don't know when they slept or how this happened, because I think this section of Mark probably was connected, that it really was a day in the life of Jesus. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he just is giving different stories as he does. Now, the people that are there when Jesus, and again, I really hope you've read this and thought about this chapter a little bit before we get here. But so when they start to get out of the boat, the man from the tomb is already running up to them. You realize that even standing there, looking out over the Sea of Galilee, he probably would have seen that storm that quit immediately. So there's already, and he saw all the boats coming. So it was a new situation. So the man from the tombs came to see him. Okay, let me find how a person is decided whether they're crazy or not. Now, this side of the Sea of Galilee has not just Jewish people, but a lot of Greeks and Romans. It was very lax in their Jewish faith. I mean, we find a herd of pigs there, and Jews were not allowed to raise, touch, or be on land that pigs were on. So what Jews were there were not a real strong belief, and there were a lot of Gentiles. Now, this man comes from the tomb, and there are 4 criteria for calling someone crazy in those days. The first one was you spent the night in a tomb, or you lived in the tombs. You would tear your clothes. You would walk around at night. And you would destroy any item given to you. If you were given things, it was very dishonorable not to dishonorable to tear them up. So this man was pretty crazy. As you read on in the verses, it talks about how no one could keep him in the chains or the fetters, and it talked about in the Greek that he would rub against him so much that he'd wear through the material. Some of this would have been made by wood. And so he runs up and he falls down before Jesus. Now, first century Palestine had in their honor society also a patron and client relationship. A patron would do something for a client who then would pay the patron back by going around and saying nice things about them and their reputation, or doing chores for them. So when you met someone of equal status, honor status, you would greet them by kissing them on the lips. If they had a higher status than you would kiss them on the cheek. But if they had a very honor status quite a bit higher than your own, you would fall down before them and greet them. And we'll see this happen a couple of times in this chapter. But I think this time when the demons in the man fall down, I don't think they're doing it out of respect. Although they could have, because they certainly knew that he was different and he was holy. So they fall down and they say to him, "What do you have to do with us?" And they're kind of snide, like, "Hey, we're not on the same team here. I'm busy doing something, you're busy doing something else. Just kind of go along and leave us alone." So they greet him in that way. And he had said one time, some of the translations make it seem like he'd been saying, but actually it was he had said, come out of him. And then he asked the demon what his name was. And the demon, I think this might have been true, and we lose this because we don't know the culture, but here he is in a land that has Roman soldiers, and they have legions of soldiers, and a legion consisted of 6,826 men. So the demon-possessed man, the demon says, "Oh, my name is Legion." In other words, there's so many of us, I'm so big and bad, you'll never be able to control me. But of course, he can control them, and they begged him to send him into a herd of pigs instead of there in the countryside, because they had found it pretty good there in that area of the country, because people weren't real strong believers in the Lord, and so their defenses were down, and they were able to cause havoc in many men and women's lives. And so the herd of pigs was nearby, and they begged him to send him there instead of to the abyss, which is torture for anybody. So Jesus gives them permission, and they go into this herd of pigs. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard one pig squeal when it's touched or confined. It's ear-shattering. My kids make fun of me because I like to watch Dr. Pol. And if you see an episode where they're restraining a pig, it is torture to listen to one pig. I cannot imagine the commotion and noise and panic of the pigs, and 2,000 of them making those noise. And so the pigs are on land that before it hits, it's elevated from the sea, and so there's a cliff that goes down into the sea, and that's where they were. So they're running, and they fall off the cliff, and of course they drowned and they died. Now the herdsmen, the ones taking care of the pigs, of course they fled to go tell the owners what had happened in the city and in the country, because they did not want to be responsible for this large herd of pigs that was worth a lot of money. They did not want to be responsible for it. And the fact that the Roman army was there, you could sell pigs to the army and make quite a good living. So this would be quite a loss to the owners. Now, whether the owners were Jewish people or not, it doesn't matter so much, because it was still within the influence of the Jewish religion, and nobody was following it very well. So it was a rough place. Not much respect for the Torah and the law. So the people come and they see the crazy man is now dressed in his right mind. That's where we get that saying. At least it's a saying I know about. And the people, instead of having a reaction of awe and reverence for what Jesus has done, they actually start begging him, pleading with him to please leave their country. And the reason this is, of course, is he's just wiped out a whole area of their income. And they don't know what else he's going to be up to, and they don't want him there. I think they also can see that this man is a holy man, and the last thing they want is a holy man around. So they beg him to go. Now, of course, Jesus leaves. He doesn't stick around where he's not wanted, so he leaves. But as he's leaving, the man that had been had the demons ran up to him. Now, see, Jesus has been in the patron-client society. You'd also have brokers, and they were a third party that would work out deals between the client and the patron. And Jesus, all this time, is being looked upon as a broker between God and the people. So this man goes up to Jesus and he wants to go with him because he knows he needs to pay back Jesus in some way for this relationship. But Jesus releases him from it and tells him to go home and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on him. So he sends him back to his family to give a public testimony to them and to the others that live in this region, and tell his story, and also how God has had mercy on him. So Jesus left behind a great witness to himself. And this is the only time he went to this area. And so this man became a missionary to this whole region. And so the man actually went out and began to proclaim his testimony and the mercy God had on him in this whole area of 10 cities. This region had been conquered in 65 BC by the Greeks and Romans, so it was a lot of Gentiles were there of that heritage as well as Jews. So there were 10 cities, so they called it the place of 10 cities. So he went back and took care of that. Well, then Jesus crosses back to Capernaum. And there, of course, is a crowd. Now, remember, in the crowd, you're going to have three types of people. You're going to have people that are just there for the excitement or for the free meal. They want to see Jesus do miracles. They want to eat the fish and the bread and just be a part of this kind of circus atmosphere. And then there's the people there that want to hurt him, the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law. They're there listening to everything he says so that they can nail him at every mistake he supposedly makes. And then there was another group of people that really desired to have a relationship with the Lord. So once again, there's a large crowd, and Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, came up to him. Now you notice that he's a ruler of the synagogue, and most of the time those officials were not on Jesus's side. But here we have Jairus come up to him and begs him. He falls at his feet, this time out of showing what he esteems Jesus to be of a high honor status than himself. And he begs Jesus to come and lay a hand on his daughter and heal her because she's dying. Now, a very high percentage of people died by the time they were teenagers, maybe 60%, maybe more. And even then, if you lived, you probably only lived till 40. So the fact that a child is dying is not uncommon, but this father's heart, and it's even a young girl. It's not a young man, but he has such a father's heart, and he's gone to Jesus. I was reading, I'm not sure where this quote came from, but Jar shows such humility, just in that he's a synagogue leader, more or less, that he's probably been very skeptical as the Jewish leadership was. And there's a quote that says, the humility to replace skepticism. We must get to the point of desperation. Let me say that better. For humility to replace skepticism, we must get to the point of desperation. Sorry, I have trouble pronouncing words sometimes. And so Jairus is desperate, and that brings the humility that he needs to come to Jesus to come heal his daughter. And so Jesus says, okay, and he goes with him. Well, the crowd's going with him too, because they want to see this. So as they're walking around with him, there was a woman who'd had an issue of blood for 12 years. Again, 12's a great number of completion, so a lot of things are 12 years. In fact, the young daughter is 12 years old, but and you'll notice that it says that she's suffering from going to the doctors. So she's not only got an issue of blood she can't find a remedy to, but she suffers at the hands of the doctors, both because she pays a lot of money, or their remedies cause her problems. Now, this widow is interesting because it says she paid for it. So for a woman to have money and to have to go herself means that she's a widow with no male relatives. And so she has spent all her money. And it seems that she's probably sought after Jesus, or I'm sorry, after God her whole life, because she has a humility. And she had just, it talked about, she had just heard the reports about Jesus. She was probably from out of town. She was there. She heard about Jesus, a holy man that had healed. And so she, in desperation, goes and thinks, if I just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. So she has faith in God. Now, the humility that she has comes out more in the fact that she was a woman, and a woman never, ever, ever, ever touches a man in public. So she would have had to have crossed that very strong cultural boundary to reach out to him. So she, in her own way, is desperate. And immediately she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Now, this is the part that really made me think the other day. I just had looked at it this way, or seen it in this way. And Jesus, perceiving in himself the power had gone out for him. Now, in other words, spiritually, there had been a healing that had occurred through his spirit. And in his mind, he did not yet recognize it till after it happened, which is an amazing way, just how many times things happen in the spirit, and it takes us a while to understand what it was or the magnitude of it. And here Jesus as a man was the same way. And he goes, so who touched my garments? And the disciples are going, well, duh. It could have been anybody, because there's a crowd around. And Peter's going, well, Jesus, anybody could have touched you. And then Jesus isn't just glancing around, he's actually looking at people. I think that's one neat thing about Jesus, is he was always involved in any interaction, even briefly, with people. And so he sees this woman, and she falls down before him again, falling at the feet of someone with greater honor. And she told him the whole truth. Jesus responds. One, he had two choices when he felt one translation says virtue. Here it's power, but it is more of a virtue. Spiritual reflex almost is the way one commentary talked about it. But he had a choice. He could have just kept walking and ignored the woman, which anybody else would have, or he could stop and talk to her. He not only stops and talks to her, which builds her faith and turns this thought or almost superstition that if I touch his clothes, I'll be healed, turns it into real connection with God, and calls her daughter. So he includes her immediately in the family of God. And he goes, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, be healed of your disease. And so that was really a precious time of Jesus always having time for people. Another thing I thought as I was reading over it again this season, he's never frazzled. I'm always frazzled. Jesus was never frazzled by the activity that went on around him. Sometimes he was angry, sometimes he was emotional, but I never see him really frazzled. And that says a lot about the peace that he has in his relationship with God, and the assurance and the knowledge that whatever happens is God's plan, and he never has to worry about the way it's going to happen, or if something happened, he knew it was God's will, because he was always in close communication. And so that kind of encourages me a lot. Okay, so they go on, and just about the time this woman's healed, there are people that come from Jairus's house and says, your daughter's dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. And so Jesus turns to him and says, do not fear, only believe. And so he's telling this man, who of course is going to have strong emotion hearing his daughter's dead, and he may have had the faith to believe that Jesus could do something while she was still alive, but there's not a whole lot he can do now that she's dead. And Jesus goes, just don't fear, just believe, and believe is trust. And so he gets to the house, and he didn't allow anybody but Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, to go with him. And these three men often are singled out to go just with him. And they went up the mountain at the Transfiguration. It was those three, and it's also those three that were with him in the garden. So they get to see Jesus's power in an intimate way, his glory at the Transfiguration, and then also his suffering at the garden. So he takes the three men with him, and the mother and the father, and they go into the room, and he says in Aramaic, little girl, I say to you, arise. And this little girl that in Aramaic was an endearment like sweetie pie, or um, uh, as a mother would talk to her daughter in a sweet way. And so immediately the girl got up and began walking. And here again is the number 12, for she was 12 years old. And Jesus, oh, can't forget this, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And this amazement, we've come across it in chapters 1 and 2, I believe, and it means to be beside yourself, or out of your mind with amazement. There's something great that's just happened and they can hardly handle it. So they were overcome with amazement. Just imagine the story there where the little girl has died, and the mother and father that love her so much that he'd even humble himself to ask this non-kosher holy man of sorts to come in and heal his daughter. And the little girl was dead, and to see her like that and have Jesus speak so kindly to her, and she responds with life. It's hard to imagine the amazement and gratitude they must have felt. And Jesus, though, then turns and strictly tells them not to tell anyone. This also has hit me pretty hard about Jesus's humility. Being fully man, he has as much temptation to lord it over people, his authority or his abilities. And here they had just mocked him. Oh, I forgot that part. They had professional mourners, remember, at the door, and they were wailing and falling apart. And then Jesus said, don't stop this commotion. She's not asleep. I mean, dead, she's asleep. And then they immediately start laughing. So you could hire mourners in those days. And so they weren't really emotionally invested in the situation, but so they quickly turned from weeping to laughing. But anyway, so here Jesus has just been humiliated by in public by a group of people, and never bends to the temptation of proving in a human way his worth. But he tells them not to tell anyone. It's getting very difficult for Jesus to move around now because of the crowd. So he didn't want this spread out. And of course, the major newspaper in those days, the only newspaper in those days was gossip. And so he's going, please don't tell people about this. And then he told them to give the little girl something to eat. Now, he's either saying that death really makes you hungry, but here he's saying, remember, there's two aspects to being healed. In that day, they did not consider you totally healed unless you are back into the community and functioning usefully. That's why many times the lepers had to be declared clean by the priest before they could go back into the community. And here Jesus is saying, look, your daughter who was sick and dead is now alive. And here is the proof. Let's give her something to eat. So now she's allowed, she's healed and able to act once again like a little girl. And so that was chapter 5 of Mark. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you'll go on and read and meditate over chapter 6 for next time. It's pretty exciting. And again, the humility Jesus has, he's going to be rejected in his hometown. So there's a lot to look at. And he also talks about his disciples should act in a humble way, and receives the bad news about his cousin who has been killed. So hope to see you next time. Thanks.